The figures that appear in textbooks, 1.1 million dead, 4 crematoria, 5 years of operation, are an abstraction. They are numbers that the brain processes and files away. What the documents, testimonies, construction blueprints, and memoirs of the executioners reveal is something different, the specific mechanics, detail by detail, of how death functions when it is industrialized. The Pelican Company supplied the ink to tattoo the numbers on the forearms. The Topf und Söhne Company from Erfurt invoiced the crematoria as if they were industrial boilers. IG Farben calculated the profitability of each prisoner down to deciding how many minimum calories they needed to remain useful before dying. There are facts about Auschwitz that do not appear in the summaries. These are 25 of those facts. On April 27, 1940, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler signed the official order for the creation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The decision did not stem from an ideological deliberation on racial extermination. It stemmed from a storage problem. The prisons in the Silesia region were full. Since the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the German occupation had generated an uninterrupted flow of arrests. Polish intellectuals, priests, teachers, army officers, community leaders. The systematic operation of eliminating the Polish elites, the intelligence action, produced more detainees than the existing prison system could contain. They needed space. The proposal came from SS Hauptsturmführer Arpad Wiegand, inspector of the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police, and deputy to SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the higher SS and police leader for Silesia. The solution that Wiegand identified was a set of abandoned barracks 50 kilometers southwest of Krakow, next to the Sola River, on the plain of the small Polish town of Oświęcim, whose German name was Auschwitz. Richard Glucks, head of the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, sent SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Eisfeld, former commander of Sachsenhausen, to evaluate the site. Eisfeld inspected it and determined it was viable. 22 brick blocks, originally built by the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War and later used as Polish barracks. Functional, unpretentious, surrounded by the town. The person Himmler chose to command the new camp was SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf Höss, 38 years old, born in Baden-Baden on November 25, 1901, into a devout Catholic family. His father had dreamed he would be ordained a priest. Höss was anything but a priest. He had participated in the so-called Femimord during the Weimar Republic, extrajudicial killings by far-right paramilitary organizations, for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The 1928 amnesty set him free. In 1934, Himmler recruited him into the SS. He spent time in Dachau and Sachsenhausen learning the methods of Theodor Eicke, the founder of the Nazi concentration camp system, before being designated to build Auschwitz from scratch. Höss settled with his wife Hedwig and his 5 children in a 2-story stucco house a few meters from the perimeter. The upper windows of that house looked directly into the prisoner blocks, less than 100 meters away. There he lived with his family while he built the camp. On June 14, 1940, the first mass transport arrived from Tarnow. 728 Polish political prisoners, professors, lawyers, doctors, priests, received serial numbers from 31 to 758. By March 1941, there were 10,900 registered prisoners. The camp that started as a storage solution turned into something different, but that process was gradual, bureaucratic, and documented. The horror of Auschwitz did not emerge out of nowhere. It was the accumulated product of administrative decisions that strayed further and further from what any reasonable person could have imagined in that April of 1940. In all Nazi concentration camps, prisoners were identified by the number sewn onto their uniform. In Auschwitz, additionally, that number was permanently engraved into the skin. Auschwitz was the only camp in the Nazi concentration camp system where prisoners were systematically tattooed. Soviet prisoners of war received the number on the left breast. Civilians on the left forearm, on the inner side. The ink used for the process was supplied by the Pelican Company, which exists as a commercial brand to this day. The reason why this practice developed, starting in 1941, was strictly functional. The mortality rate was so high that deteriorated bodies could no longer be identified by the number sewn onto the uniform. When a prisoner died, from exhaustion, hunger, a beating, and the uniform was too deteriorated or had been removed, it became impossible to know to whom the corpse belonged and what their serial number was. The bureaucratic system demanded it. The numbers had to square. The records had to be precise. The tattoo solved the problem. The number on the skin remained legible even when the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. The identification system went beyond the number. Each category of prisoner wore a fabric triangle sewn under the number: red for political prisoners, mostly Poles; green for common criminals; black for the so-called asocials; vagrants, prostitutes, Romania; purple for Jehovah's Witnesses; and pink for homosexual men, mostly Germans. Jews wore the yellow Star of David, formed by two superimposed triangles, with an additional letter indicating the nationality of the wearer. Within this classification existed an explicit racial hierarchy. German prisoners occupied the highest rung of the internal system, then non-Jews from other countries. At the base, the Jews, to whom even the right to receive mail was denied. On Sundays, when the other prisoners could write letters to their families in German, censored by the SS, Jewish prisoners could do nothing. They were also deprived of watches and calendars, preventing them from knowing what day or what month it was. Only 2 Jewish calendars clandestinely manufactured in the camp survived until the liberation. What the identification system reveals is the character of the Nazi bureaucracy, a racial hierarchy coded in colors, letters, and numbers, transferred to the skin of the victims so that the records of the extermination would be impeccably precise. Zyklon B arrived in Auschwitz to kill lice. It was an industrial-use pesticide derived from research on hydrocyanic acid conducted in part by the German chemist Fritz Haber, who had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 and was, with an irony that history could hardly have manufactured, Jewish. Zyklon B was produced in the form of small crystals impregnated with the active compound, designed to be poured into enclosed spaces where its evaporation eliminated insects. The distributing company was Degesch, a subsidiary of IG Farben. In Auschwitz, Zyklon B was stored from the first months of the camp in disinfection chambers where uniforms, blankets, and other objects were treated to eliminate the lice that inevitably proliferated in the overcrowded conditions. The bluish stains that the compound left on the brick walls were identifiable decades after the war. The step from killing lice to killing people was the initiative of an officer who later described it as a test of efficiency. In the summer of 1941, academic consensus places it in August, SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fritsch, deputy Lagerführer of the camp, led a group of Soviet prisoners of war into the basement of Block 11 and poured Zyklon B crystals. The experiment was imperfect. The dosage was incorrect, the space too compartmentalized, the ventilation insufficient for the expected results. The death process took between 2 and 3 days. Some prisoners did not die immediately. Fritsch took note. The second experiment, documented between September 3rd and 5th, 1941, was more methodical. Approximately 850 people, mainly Soviet prisoners of war, along with a group of sick Polish inmates selected from the camp hospital, were led to the Crematorium 1 building. They were told they were going to receive new clothes and that they had to undress before entering. The doors closed. The lights went out. Zyklon B was introduced from the outside through openings in the roof. The process worked. Rudolf Höss wrote about this discovery in his memoirs written during his captivity before his execution and published in German in 1958 as Commandant in Auschwitz. He described having felt a certain relief. He was disturbed by the prospect of mass executions by firing squad, such as those practiced by the Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front. He had seen his soldiers grow sick and break down morally when forced to shoot civilians at close range. The gas, he argued, allowed the executors to distance themselves from the act. This rationalization, that the gas was more humane for the executors, was pronounced by the man who commanded the largest extermination facility in history. Crematorium 1 of Auschwitz I, converted into a gas chamber, had a capacity for between 700 and 800 people simultaneously. Its interior walls were painted white. Fake showerheads were installed on the ceiling. The airtight iron doors were reinforced. What Fritsch began as an experiment in efficiency that summer of 1941 turned, in less than 2 years, into an operation capable of processing 4,416 bodies every 24 hours. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking officials of the Nazi government and the SS met at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin, to coordinate the extermination of the 11 million European Jews. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Chaired by SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, the conference featured the participation of representatives from various Reich ministries and the SS. The minutes of the meeting, drafted by Adolf Eichmann and preserved in the archives, describe in impassive bureaucratic language the plan for what they euphemistically termed the final solution to the Jewish question. The 11 million European Jews identified in the calculations of the participants were classified by country and nation as if they were an industrial production statistic. 90 minutes. Auschwitz was already operational when Wannsee took place. The first experiments with Zyklon B had occurred months before. The trains were already arriving. But Wannsee institutionalized, coordinated and accelerated what had already begun, turning it from a series of local initiatives into a state policy coordinated on a continental scale. The original protocol of the conference was found in 1947 by American prosecutor Robert Kempner among the archives of the German Foreign Ministry. It had survived the war because no one had destroyed it. Eichmann had classified it as a Reich secret, Geheime Reichssache, and filed it with the other documents of the department. 30 copies of the protocol had been sent to the participants. Only this copy survived. The document has 16 pages. What the Wannsee Conference demonstrates is the character of the machinery that operated Auschwitz, not a conspiracy of criminals in the shadows, but a bureaucratic meeting with minutes and attendance lists where officials with university degrees, with families at home and with letters of recommendation, resolved in 90 minutes the logistics of the greatest crime in history. The construction of Auschwitz to Birkenau began in October 1941 in Brzezinka, Birkenau in German, an agricultural village 3 kilometers from the main camp. To make space for it, 7 villages were eliminated, their Polish inhabitants expelled, their houses demolished or appropriated for SS use. The name Birkenau means birch forest. SS Sturmbannführer Karl Bischoff, SS architect and head of the camp's construction directorate, supervised the design. The initial budget was 8.9 million Reichsmarks, soon insufficient. Bischoff's original plan provided barracks for 550 prisoners each. The demand for space grew so quickly that the figure was revised to 744 per barrack, bringing the total capacity from 97,000 to 125,000 people. The barracks at Birkenau were, for the most part, wooden structures originally designed as horse stables for the German army. Each measured 35.4 by 11 meters, divided into 62 compartments of 4 square meters, subdivided in turn into perches, the term prisoners used for the wooden platforms where they slept, initially designed for 3 people and expanded to 4 when pressure demanded it. Alfred Czesław Przybylski, a Polish prisoner who worked on the construction, stated in his testimony that the choice of the site on marshy ground, when dry ground was available a short distance away, had not been accidental. He stated he had the firm conviction that the choice of the site on damp ground was intended to exterminate the prisoners who worked there and also those who would inhabit the buildings. The marshy ground meant soils that turned into quagmires in periods of rain. It meant cold that penetrated from below into the wooden bunks. It meant stagnant water that favored the proliferation of mosquitoes and disease. The barracks lacked effective thermal insulation, brutal in winter, suffocating in summer. In many barracks, the windows could not be opened. Romano Frista, a writer who survived Birkenau, recalled the winter nights decades later. The barracks were never heated, and the stoves in them were used as tables. After the evening roll calls, which lasted forever, there was no place where we could warm ourselves. We went to sleep without taking off our clothes, sometimes without taking off our shoes. The first to inhabit Birkenau while building it were 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war who arrived between October 7th and 25th, 1941. They lived in the mud, in unfinished buildings, without heating, with minimal rations. By March 1st, 1942, only 945 remained registered. More than 9,000 people in less than 5 months, dead from cold, hunger and disease. Birkenau reached its peak in May 1944, with 90,000 registered prisoners simultaneously in its more than 300 barracks. But that figure does not reflect the real traffic of people who passed through the camp. Most of those who arrived on the trains were never registered. They went directly from the train cars to the gas chamber. The day in Auschwitz began at 4:30 in the morning in summer, at 5:30 in winter, the only concession the system made to the Polish cold. A metallic gong echoed through the blocks. The block supervisor immediately began beating the inmates with sticks to force them to get up. The first goal was personal hygiene, in theory. The washrooms were communal buildings where dozens or hundreds of men had to wash simultaneously with cold, frequently dirty water, without soap, in a matter of minutes. Primo Levi described the washroom of Auschwitz III in 1944 as a place badly lit, full of drafts, with the brick floor covered by a layer of mud. The walls of the washroom were decorated with frescoes. The good prisoner, shaved head, diligently soaping himself with the sign "So bist du rein," this is how you are clean. The bad prisoner, with a pronounced Semitic nose, dirty clothes, with the sign "So gehst du ein," this is how you end up badly. The propaganda reached even the walls of the bathrooms. The latrines deserve a separate description. In Sector B, IA of Auschwitz II Birkenau, the toilets were concrete channels with 58 holes to sit on, accessible only twice a day, morning and evening, for a strictly limited time. A prisoner was assigned to time how long the workers took. Those who took too long were beaten. Gynecologist Gisela Perl, a survivor of the women's camp, wrote in 1948 that there was one latrine for between 30,000 and 32,000 women, and that they were only allowed to use it at certain hours of the day. She described rows of women knee-deep in human excrement, a deep ditch with planks laid across where they squatted so tightly packed that we could not avoid dirtying each other. After hygiene, the roll call, the appel. The prisoners lined up in the courtyard in rows of 10. The counting could last minutes or endless hours depending on the mood of the officers on duty and whether the numbers squared. On July 6, 1940, the roll call lasted 19 hours because Tadeusz Wojewski had escaped. Hundreds of prisoners remained standing all through the night and much of the following day. The guards could impose additional punishments for motives bordering on the absurd: a missing button, a badly washed plate, a posture that did not seem straight enough. The workday lasted 11 hours, much of it outdoors. Construction sites, quarries, gravel pits, sawmills. No breaks allowed. The Polish cold could drop below 20 degrees below zero between November and March. The striped uniforms made of thin fabric provided no thermal protection. Viktor Frankl, a Viennese psychiatrist who survived the camp, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that at times it was so cold that prisoners urinated on themselves to warm up momentarily. The diet represented between 1,300 and 1,700 calories daily for men performing intense physical labor for 11 hours. The basic caloric requirement under those conditions was between 3,500 and 4,000 calories. The deficit of 50 to 60% was deliberate and calculated. Historian Peter Hayes describes how in Monowitz prisoners were reduced to walking skeletons within a period of 3 to 4 months. At 7 in the evening, the second roll call. If any prisoner had died during the day, the corpse had to be brought back to the camp and presented at the count. The co-workers of the deceased carried the body, lights out at 9 at night, in wooden bunks on 3 levels, with up to 4 people per compartment designed for one. The prisoners slept with their clothes on and their shoes under their bodies so they would not be stolen. Among the most disturbing details of the daily system of Auschwitz, there is one that at first glance seems incompatible with the surrounding horror: music. An orchestra of prisoners, known as the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra in the case of the women's camp, was forced to play cheerful music while the workers left through the camp gates toward their workdays. Marches, popular pieces, lively melodies, the same music played when the columns returned at dusk. The stated reason was operational: to facilitate the passage of the prisoners in orderly columns and simplify the count for the guards, who counted more easily when the prisoners marched to the rhythm of the music. But the effect on those who listened to it possessed a cruelty of a different dimension. At the head of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra was Alma Rosé from 1943 until her death in the camp in April 1944. Niece of the composer Gustav Mahler, daughter of the violinist Arnold Rosé, and one of the most brilliant European violinists of her generation, Alma Rosé had fled Nazi Germany, had lost her first husband in Holland, and had been captured in 1943 trying to cross the Swiss border from France. She arrived in Auschwitz in July of that year. Under her direction, the women's orchestra reached a musical level that several survivor testimonies describe as extraordinarily high for the circumstances. Rosé was demanding to the point of cruelty with her group, but she also protected them. The female musicians of the ensemble had marginally better living conditions than the rest of the female prisoners, which for many meant the difference between surviving and not doing so. The night Rosé died, suddenly on April 4, 1944, of causes that were never determined with certainty, although poisoning was a consistent hypothesis, it is said that the women of the ensemble wept openly, something that in Auschwitz required a measure of desperation that transcended fear. The men's orchestra of Auschwitz one existed from October 1940. In both cases, the prisoner musicians were recruited for their ability to play an instrument, regardless of their previous training or category. A carpenter who played the violin could move to the orchestra and temporarily step away from the most destructive physical labor. The image of prisoner musicians playing marches while their companions marched to exhaustion and the cold is one of the most enduring of the camp. Not for its beauty, but for what it reveals about the nature of the system, the capacity to integrate culture, art, and music as tools of control. The deportees arrived in Auschwitz in cargo wagons, designed to transport cattle or goods, not people, without seats, without windows or with minimal windows covered with wire, without bathrooms, a bucket in the corner for hundreds of people, without guaranteed drinking water. The travel time depended on the origin, from Hungary between 1 and 3 days, from France between 2 and 3 days, from the Netherlands approximately 3, from Greece, from Thessaloniki, where one of the oldest Jewish communities in the Mediterranean lived, with more than 500 years of history rooted in that city. The journey could last 10 days or more. 10 days. In those conditions, the overcrowding could be such that people could not sit down. They remained standing for hours or days, pushed against other people, breathing the foul air of the closed wagon. In summer, the heat could be fatal. In winter, the cold penetrated through the wooden planks. Many died during the transit. The corpses remained in the wagon alongside the survivors until the doors opened. The Alte Judenrampe, the old Jewish ramp, was the unloading platform used from 1942 until May 1944, located between Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II-Birkenau, 2.5 kilometers from the gas chambers. The deportees had to walk that distance in columns supervised by guards with dogs. The automobile that accompanied each transport carried the Red Cross symbol. It transported the Zyklon B. The SS doctor riding in that vehicle was there to ensure that no SS officer was accidentally poisoned during the gassing process. In May 1944, to manage the transports of Hungarian Jews, which at their time of greatest intensity reached 12,000 people daily, the railway spur that penetrated directly into the perimeter of Birkenau was completed. The new ramp sat a few meters away from crematoria 2 and 3. The train entered through the arch of the watchtower, advanced slowly along the interior tracks, and stopped. From that moment, the journey to death was measured in meters. The deportees arrived after days of travel in conditions that were already lethal, disoriented, exhausted, dehydrated. Most did not understand where they were or what awaited them. That was part of the design. When a transport arrived in Auschwitz, the process that followed was selection. The deportees were divided into 2 groups. To the right, those considered fit to work. To the left, the others. According to the calculations of Polish historian Franciszek Piper, out of the 1.095 million Jews deported to Auschwitz, approximately 205,000 were registered in the camp and received a serial number. Some 25,000 were sent to other camps. The remaining 865,000, nearly 80%, were murdered directly upon arrival, without being registered, without receiving a number. They never officially existed as prisoners. The selection criterion had its own coded rules, although its application depended on the officer on duty. The general guidelines were clear: all children under 14 or 15 years old, everyone who arrived with small children in their arms because it implied they were mothers or caregivers, therefore not available for work, All the elderly, everyone who presented visible signs of illness or incapacity. Children were forced to walk toward a stick held at a certain height. Those who could pass underneath were selected for death. The historian Raoul Hilberg wrote that practically any defect, scars, bandages, boils, emaciation, could be sufficient reason to be considered unfit for work. Those selected for work, that 20 or 25%, were registered as prisoners. The rest were led toward the crematoria along a path designed to maintain calm. They were told they were going to shower and be deloused. They were asked to remember the number of the hook where they had hung their clothes to retrieve them afterward. The SS knew that if the victims understood what awaited them, the logistical process would become exponentially complicated. The deception was a tool of operational control, not a humanitarian consideration. This figure, 865,000 people gassed without ever being registered, has an additional implication that frequently goes unnoticed. It means that the statistics of the dead in Auschwitz are built in large part from records that the camp itself generated. Of those who were murdered before entering the registration system, there is no list. Their existence must be reconstructed from the deportation records of the communities of origin, which in many cases were also destroyed. Josef Mengele arrived in Auschwitz II on May 30, 1943, with the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer and 2 doctorates, one in medicine and another in anthropology, both from the University of Frankfurt. He was 32 years old. He was punctual, meticulous, and presented himself at the selection ramp elegantly uniformed, with white gloves and a riding crop. His shout during the selection, "Zwillinge heraus," was the announcement for identical twins to step forward. Twins were his specific scientific obsession, along with dwarfs, people with malformations, and carriers of hereditary diseases. He established a kindergarten in barracks 29 and 31 of Birkenau for the children he experimented on, where they received better food rations than the rest of the prisoners. The selected twins had all parts of their bodies measured, they were photographed, and dental, vision, and hearing analyses were performed on them. Blood was drawn from them, surgeries were performed on them, cross-blood transfusions. When one of the twins died, from any cause, Mengele ordered the other to be killed to perform simultaneous autopsies and compare the results. Eva Moses Kor, a survivor who suffered the experiments alongside her twin sister Miriam, founded the group Candles, Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiment Survivors, decades later, and described the procedures with a precision that has been verified by multiple corroborating testimonies. The twins were injected with pathogenic germs to study how their immune systems responded in parallel. But Mengele was not alone. Karl Klauberg, SS Hauptsturmführer and gynecologist, injected chemical substances into the uteri of women to attempt to obstruct them permanently as a method of mass sterilization. Horst Schumann irradiated the genitals of men and women with X-rays to cause sterilization through radiation damage. The men whom this procedure left incapacitated for work could be sent directly to the gas chamber. Rudolf Brandt and Wolfram Sievers, general director of the Ahnenerbe, the pseudoscientific research institute of the SS, delivered the skeletons of 87 Jewish prisoners selected for their racial characteristics to the Anatomical Institute of the Reichsuniversität in Strasbourg under the direction of Professor August Hirt. The prisoners were murdered in August 1943 at the Natzweiler Struthof camp to complete the skeleton collection. Kurt Heismeyer, an SS doctor, took 20 Polish Jewish children from Auschwitz to the Neuengamme camp near Hamburg, where he injected them with the tuberculosis bacillus to test potential cures. In April 1945, when the Allied advance threatened to cause the discovery of the experiment, the children were hanged to eliminate the evidence. The doctor's trial in Nuremberg, held between 1946 and 1947, and which was the first of the 12 trials that followed the main trial, formulated for the first time in international law the principles of the Nuremberg Code on medical ethics. All those principles had been systematically violated in Block 10 of Auschwitz. Brandt and Sievers were executed in 1948. Klauberg was captured by the Soviets, sentenced in 1948 to 25 years, released in 1955 within the framework of a prisoner exchange, and died in 1957 in West Germany while awaiting a second trial. Mengele fled to Argentina and died in 1979 in Brazil without having been tried. 7 kilometers east of Auschwitz I, The chemical conglomerate IG Farben chose a site in 1941 to build a Buna N factory, the synthetic rubber essential for the German war effort. The choice was not accidental. The Oststeuergesetz, the Eastern Tax Assistance Law of December 1940, offered tax exemptions to corporations willing to develop industries in the border regions of the East. The Auschwitz concentration camp, a few kilometers away, represented a source of virtually free labor. The railway access and proximity to raw materials completed the economic argument. In February 1941, Himmler ordered that the Jewish population of Oswiecim be expelled to make space for the German specialized workers. The camp prisoners began working on the demolition of houses in Monowitz in April of that year. By May, due to a shortage of trucks, several hundred of them woke up at 3 in the morning to walk twice a day from Auschwitz I to the construction site. When the SS administrators worried that a long line of exhausted prisoners passing through the town of Oswiecim would damage German-Polish relations, they ordered the prisoners to shave daily, keep clean, and sing while marching. In October 1942, IG Farben finished the complex. Auschwitz III Monowitz, the first concentration camp financed and built by private industry. It measured 270 by 490 meters. By the end of 1944, it housed 60 barracks. IG Farben paid the SS between 3 and 4 Reichsmarks per shift of 9 to 11 hours for each inmate. The company calculated and monetized human life as a production input. Between 1943 and 1944, approximately 35,000 inmates worked at the plant. Of them, 23,000 died from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion, an average of 32 deaths per day. The deaths and transfers to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, too, reduced the camp population by nearly 1/5 every month. The smell of the crematoria drifted over Monowitz depending on the wind direction. Bayer, then part of IG Farben, paid 150 Reichsmarks for each group of 150 female prisoners to test an anesthetic. A Bayer employee wrote in a letter to Huss, preserved in the camp archives, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we could not obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We beg you to send us another group of women with the same amount and at the same price." Other German companies that established factories with their own subcamps: Krupp, Siemens Schuckert, the ink to tattoo the numbers on the forearms Pelikan, the Zyklon B, Degesch, a subsidiary of IG Farben. On August 20th, 1944, Allied aircraft bombed the IG Farben plant in Monowitz for the first time. They returned on September 13th, October 18th, and December 26th. The explosions destroyed installations. The prisoners continued working in the rubble. The IG Farben synthetic rubber factory in Monowitz never came to produce a single pound of rubber. The war ended before the plant reached full operational capacity. 23,000 people died to build and operate a facility that produced nothing. The blueprints for crematoria 2 and 3 of Auschwitz-Birkenau were not drawn by the SS. They were drawn by the Topf und Söhne Company, based in Erfurt, Germany. Topf und Söhne was a company specialized in ventilation systems, industrial ovens, and drying equipment for breweries and other industrial uses. Its engineers, civilians, employees of a private company with shareholders and accounting, maintained detailed technical correspondence with the SS of Auschwitz about the air extraction systems of the gas chambers, the resistance of the refractory bricks to the temperatures of the ovens, and the capacity of the elevators that would transport the corpses from the underground locker rooms to the oven rooms. Each crematorium at Birkenau was an integrated complex of 3 elements: an undressing room, the Auskleiderraum, with numbered coat racks on the walls, an underground gas chamber of 30 by 7 meters, and an oven room. Crematoria 2 and 3 had a nominal capacity of 1,440 bodies in 24 hours each. Crematoria 4 and 5, of a different design with dressing rooms and chambers on the ground floor, 768 each. In total, 4,416 bodies in 24 hours. The Sonderkommando, loading 3 to 5 corpses simultaneously into each oven, could reach approximately 8,000 cremations daily at moments of greatest pressure. The average capacity between 1942 and 1944 was around 1,000 bodies per day. For the summer of 1944, in addition to the crematoria, open-air cremation pits were excavated behind Crematorium 5 for the days when the ovens could not keep up. The columns of smoke were visible from kilometers around. The smell was perceptible in the neighboring villages. The archives of Topfunzona survived the war. The blueprints of the crematoria, the technical letters, the invoices, they are preserved. The architects of Auschwitz-Birkenau forgot to destroy the blueprints of the construction directorate because they were kept in a different building from that of the main records, which were burned. In 2009, the German newspaper Bild acquired 29 of these documents and deposited them in the Yad Vashem archives. Among those survived documents, the blueprint dated October 14, 1941, of the complete Birkenau camp, the blueprint of October 8, 1941, for a barrack with capacity for 550 prisoners, signed by Bischoff, the blueprints of crematoria 2 and 3, a two-dimensional sketch of the entrance to the camp that would become the most recognized image of the Holocaust. The mass extermination was an engineering project with archival documentation. The process to which the victims were subjected inside the crematoria had been designed in every detail to maintain calm until the last possible moment. The victims were led downstairs to the undressing rooms. The SS told them that after the shower they would receive hot coffee. The signs on the walls pointed out the importance of remembering the number of the coat rack where they had left their clothes to be able to retrieve them afterward. The fake shower heads installed on the ceiling of the gas chamber completed the illusion. The signs inside the installations used words such as Bade, bath, or Desinfektionsraum, disinfection room. The automobile transporting the Zyklon B carried the Red Cross symbol. Once in the chamber, which could house up to 2,000 people, the airtight doors closed. The SS men with gas masks approached the openings in the roof. They opened the cans of Zyklon B. They poured the bluish crystals toward the interior. Leib Langfuss, a member of the Sonderkommando, buried his diary written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3 of Auschwitz II. It was found in 1952. In it he wrote about what he heard from the other side of the closed doors. They only cried out with bitter and lamentable voices. Others complained with voices full of despair, and others still sobbed spasmodically and uttered a heartbreaking and terrible weeping. And meanwhile, their voices grew weaker and weaker. He described how, because of the great crowding, people fell one over another while dying, until a pile of 5 or 6 superimposed layers was formed, reaching a height of 1 meter. The death process took between 10 and 20 minutes. Rudolf Höss declared before the Nuremberg prosecutors that it took up to 20 minutes. The bodies, according to the consistent testimony of several members of the Sonderkommando, piled up in strata when the chamber was full. At the bottom, the weakest: children, the elderly, women. At the top, the youngest and most robust, who had tried to climb toward the last centimeters of unpoisoned air. When the doors opened, the Sonderkommando began their work. They removed the glasses, the dental prostheses, the orthopedic appliances. They shaved the hair of the women. In Auschwitz, unlike other extermination camps, the hair was cut after death, not before. Then they extracted the gold from the teeth, removed the jewelry, and incinerated the corpses. The deception was not a humanitarian consideration. It was a tool of operational control, as long as the victims believed they were going to shower. The logistical process functioned without the need for additional violence that could create complications. By February 6, 1943, the Reich Ministry of Economics had received 3,000 kilograms of hair originating from Auschwitz and Majdanek. The hair cut from the victims after gassing, and from the prisoners upon entering the camp, was subjected to a specific process. It was first cleaned in a solution of ammonium salt, dried on the brick floors of the crematoria themselves, combed and packed in paper bags. Then it was sent to textile factories in Germany, where it was converted into industrial fabrics, stuffing for mattresses, insulating felts, laces for military boots. A manufacturing plant in Bremen-Blumenthal received it on a regular basis. The workers at that plant found small coins with Greek letters in some of the braids, possibly from the approximately 50,000 Greek Jews deported to Auschwitz in 1943. When the Red Army liberated the camp in January 1945, it found 7,000 kilograms of human hair in bags ready to be sent. The gold extracted from the teeth met a different fate. Starting on September 23, 1940, by order of Himmler, the gold from dead prisoners was sent to the SS Health Service to be used by the Corps' dentists in the dental treatment of SS officers and their families. By October 8, 1942, 50 kilograms had been accumulated. At the beginning of 1944, between 10 and 12 kilograms were extracted monthly. The extraction work was performed by members of the Sonderkommando who had knowledge of dentistry. Any member of the Sonderkommando who overlooked a dental job, who did not extract a piece containing gold, could be incinerated alive. The ashes of the corpses were buried in mass graves, thrown into the Vistula River, or used as fertilizer in the agricultural fields of the Interessengebiet. The remains of bone that had not burned completely were crushed in wooden mortars. The system was designed to leave no trace, but it left a trace. The Red Army, in addition to the 7,000 kilograms of hair, found 837,000 women's garments, 370,000 men's suits, and 44,000 pairs of shoes in the camp's Canada warehouses. In Auschwitz I, between Block 10 and Block 11, there was a courtyard surrounded by high walls. On one of those walls, in front of Block 11, there was a reinforced wooden wall that served as a place of execution. Prisoners were led naked to that wall with their hands tied behind their backs and shot in the back of the neck. The first executions there took place on November 11, 1941, Polish National Independence Day, involving 151 people. This space came to be known as the Wall of Death. It is calculated that approximately 4,500 Polish political prisoners were executed in that courtyard, including members of the camp's internal resistance. Another 10,000 Poles were brought to the camp exclusively to be executed without being registered as prisoners. Block 11 itself, known as Block 13 until 1941, was the prison within the prison. Reserved for prisoners suspected of resistance activities, it contained punishment cells in the basement of a cruelty thought out in every detail. Cell 22, the standing cell without windows, the stay bunker, was divided into 4 sections, each less than 1 square meter. 4 prisoners entered it through a trapdoor next to the floor, a vent of 5 by 5 centimeters, prisoners who spent weeks in those conditions. The capos who supervised the prisoners during work received nicknames that historian Irina Strzelecka documented in her research: Bloody, Iron, the Strangler, the Boxer. The documented motives for punishment in the 275 existing reports in the Auschwitz archives include returning for a second time to the food line, removing gold teeth to buy bread, entering the pigsty to steal food from the pigs, putting hands in pockets. Flogging during the roll call was routine. A table called the goat immobilized the prisoners' feet in a box while they were whipped on top of it. The prisoners had to count the blows out loud in German. 25 Amity besten Dank habe ich erhalten. 25 received with many thanks. If they made a mistake in the figure, the flogging resumed from the beginning. The punishment of the post consisted of tying the hands behind the back with chains attached to hooks, raising the chains until the prisoners were left hanging by their wrists. If the shoulders were damaged to the point of preventing work, the prisoner could be sent to the gas chamber. Rudolf Höss wrote that execution orders arrived in an uninterrupted flow. According to SS officer Perry Broad, among those condemned to the Wall of Death, there were men who, at that last moment, shouted, "Long live Poland," or "Long live freedom." The Sonderkommando, the special detachment, was the group of prisoners forced to operate the extermination installations. They guided the victims to the dressing rooms. They pulled the corpses out of the gas chambers. They removed the dental gold. They shaved the hair. They incinerated the bodies in the ovens or in the open-air pits. They were mainly Jews. In 1940 and 1941, when there was only one operational gas chamber, the Sonderkommando had 20 members. By the end of 1943, there were 400. In 1944, during the genocide of the Hungarian Jews, they reached 874. They lived separated from the rest of the prisoners, although this rule was not always applied to the non-Jews among them. Their material conditions were marginally better: access to clothes and food from the new arrivals, their own space to sleep. But no material privilege could compensate for what they knew, that they would be murdered and replaced on a regular basis to guarantee that the witnesses of the process did not survive. The system systematically eliminated its own witnesses. The most documented example, in December 1942, the last 400 members of the Sonderkommando who had operated Crematorium I of Auschwitz I who had been previously forced to unearth and burn more than 100,000 corpses from the mass graves of Auschwitz II, were led back to Crematorium I and gassed. Once the work was completed, the group that had performed it was eliminated. Despite this certainty, several members of the Sonderkommando made the decision to document what they saw. Salman Lowenthal buried his notebooks written in Yiddish near Crematorium III. They were found in 1962. Leib Langfuss buried his near the same crematorium. It was found in 1952. Zalman Gradowski also buried his writings, in which he described the procedures with a precision that decades later served as fundamental evidence for historians. An unknown member of the Sonderkommando made charcoal drawings in the so-called Auschwitz sketchbook, 22 illustrations showing the process from the descent from the train to the ovens, 4 clandestine photographs of the extermination process taken from inside the camp and smuggled out in September 1944 inside a tube of toothpaste reached the hands of the Polish resistance. Approximately 100 members of the Sonderkommando survived the liquidation of the camp. They were forced to participate in the death march toward Mauthausen, where 3 days after arriving they were asked to present themselves for roll call. None did. Without records identifying them as Sonderkommando, several of them survived. Captain Witold Pilecki of the Polish Home Army allowed himself to be arrested. On September 19, 1940, during a Gestapo roundup in the Żoliborz neighborhood in Warsaw, Pilecki deliberately placed himself in the area of the operation, was captured and deported to Auschwitz. He arrived at the camp under the alias Tomasz Serafiński and received serial number 4859. His mission was twofold: to organize a resistance network inside the camp and to get information to the Polish government in exile in London about what was occurring in Auschwitz. From inside, Pilecki organized the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the military organization union, and began sending reports clandestinely through liberated prisoners who acted as couriers. His first report, transmitted orally through the Polish engineer Alexander Wielkopolski, liberated in October 1940, reached Warsaw the following month. By 1942, Pilecki had managed to establish a stable communication network. He remained in Auschwitz almost 2.5 years. On April 27, 1943, he escaped from the camp, along with 2 companions during the night, using a bakery worker's uniform. In his second comprehensive report, the so-called W report, Pilecki estimated that 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, had been murdered in Auschwitz. The report was distributed among the Allies by the Polish government in exile. The response was slow, insufficient, or directly did not arrive. According to historian Michael Fleming, the British press responded in 1943 and the first half of 1944 either by not publishing the reports about Auschwitz or by publishing them on the inside pages. The British Foreign Ministry was reticent because it feared that the public could pressure the government to act or to provide refuge for the Jews. A similar concern existed in the United States. Pilecki survived the war and participated in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He was executed by the Polish Communist government in 1948, accused of espionage for Western intelligence and of anti-Polish activities. He was posthumously rehabilitated in 1990. On April 27, 1944, Rudolf Werber, serial number 44070, and Alfred Wetzler, number 29162, escaped from Auschwitz to Birkenau. Their plan had taken months to prepare. They hid for 3 days in a hiding place that companions had dug under a pile of wood stored just outside the inner electrified perimeter, covered with tobacco sprinkled with gasoline to confuse the tracking dogs. When the alert was lifted, the SS assumed that any fugitive would have left the search area already after 3 days. They came out and walked south. They arrived in Slovakia 10 days later. Before the Slovak Jewish Council in Žilina, Werber and Wetzler dictated for days a 32-page report that described with technical and geographical precision the operation of the extermination installations of Auschwitz, the layout of the crematoria, the capacity of the gas chambers, the selection process on the ramp, the figures of deportees from the different European countries, the operation of the Sonderkommando. The Werber-Wetzler report, known also as the Auschwitz report, was the first document to describe from inside with operational precision the mechanism of mass extermination. It was translated into Hungarian, English, and German. Its circulation in June 1944, when the Hungarian deportations were at full intensity, contributed directly to the decision of Regent Miklos Horthy to temporarily suspend the transports from Hungary in July of that year. On May 27, 1944, Arnost Rosin and Czesław Mordowicz also escaped to Slovakia. Their testimonies were combined with those of Werber and Wetzler, and with the report of the Polish prisoner Jerzy Tabot, who had escaped on November 19, 1943, to form the so-called Auschwitz Protocols. Published in full in November 1944 by the War Refugee Board of the United States, they were the first complete public exposure of what occurred in the camp. By the time the protocols were published, the crematoria of Birkenau had processed 437,000 Hungarian Jews. On October 7, 1944, the architects of the camp calculated that something was impossible, and it happened. The trigger was the announcement that 300 members of the Sonderkommando would be transferred to clear rubble in a nearby village. The members of the Sonderkommando knew exactly what those transfers meant. The groups that had arrived before them had disappeared in that very same way. The group, composed mainly of Greek and Hungarian Jews, rose up with what they had at hand: stones, hammers, work tools. They killed 3 SS guards. They set fire to Crematorium 4 with rags soaked in oil stolen from the engine room. Crematorium 4 burned. The members of the Sonderkommando of Crematorium 2, upon hearing the explosion, believed that the revolt had spread to the entire camp. They threw their German capo into one of the burning ovens. They cut the electrified wire with pliers they had obtained clandestinely and fled toward Reichskoe, where they hid in the barn of an Auschwitz subcamp. The SS arrived, surrounded the building, and set it on fire. When the rebellion was crushed, 451 members of the Sonderkommando had been murdered. 4 women who had supplied the explosives from the Auschwitz munitions factory, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estera Weichblum, and Regina Safirstein, were arrested, tortured to obtain information, and publicly hanged on January 6, 1945. The 212 members of the Sonderkommando who survived the revolt lived several months more. Zalman Gradowski, who died during or shortly after the rebellion, had buried his notebooks written in Yiddish near Crematorium 3. After the war, another survivor of the Sonderkommando indicated to the prosecutors where to dig. The notes were found and published decades later under the title From the Heart of Hell. The revolt of the Sonderkommando is the only armed uprising that took place inside the extermination complex of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It failed in its military objectives, but the blueprints, drawings, and documents that its members had buried survived. In May and June 1944, during the Hungarian deportations, the photographic identification team, the Erkennungsdienst of Auschwitz, documented the arrival process of the transports with more than 200 photographs. Those images, known collectively as the Auschwitz album, constitute the most complete visual record that exists of the selection process. They show entire families, men with hats, women with coats, children holding hands, elderly people leaning on canes. They show the descent of the deportees from the train cars, the formation of columns, the SS doctors pointing with their fingers, but they were taken by the SS themselves. The historian James Bulgen pointed out in an academic analysis that these images are extremely fragile historically, if they are not used critically, because they represent the selection process just as the SS wanted it to be seen: orderly, controlled, efficient. Absent from them are the terror, the screams of the children separated from their mothers, the chaos of those who understood where they were. Present are the officers in impeccable uniform and the appearance of a routine procedure. The album was found after the war by Lily Jacob, a Hungarian survivor who recognized in it images of her family and her community in an abandoned barrack of the Dora Mittelbau camp. The photographs were deposited in Yad Vashem, where they remain as one of the most important and most complex documents of the Holocaust. What the album shows, and what it hides, is a testimony to the deliberate construction of a narrative by the regime. The machinery of extermination also produced its own official iconography. The 4 clandestine photographs of the Sonderkommando, taken with a camera smuggled into the camp, which show corpses next to the open-air cremation pits and groups of women walking toward the gas chamber, represent the documentary counterpoint that the images of the official album omit. On May 16, 1944, the SS attempted to liquidate the family camp of the Romani, the Zigeuner Familienlager, Sector B1Y of Birkenau, where, atypically and for reasons that historians have not determined with certainty, Romani families lived and had been authorized to remain together. The Romani resisted, armed with knives, iron pipes and work tools. They barricaded themselves in the barracks. The SS withdrew. It was not the first time that the Romani had put up resistance. 2 Czech Romani prisoners, Ignaz and Frank Denhel, had attempted to escape in December 1942, the second successfully. The Auschwitz registry, the Hauptbucher, documents that 20,946 Romani were registered prisoners in the camp. It is estimated that another 3,000 entered without being registered. After the failed attempt of May 1944, the SS transferred nearly 2,908 Romani to other camps over the following months to use them as forced labor. On August 2, 1944, the 2,897 Romani who remained in the family camp, mainly the elderly, the sick and children who had not been able to be transferred, were gassed in crematoria 2 and 3 of Birkenau. In total, it is estimated that 500,000 Romani were murdered during the Second World War in what the Romani community terms the porajmos, the devouring. Of them, at least 21,000 died in Auschwitz. The international recognition of the Romani genocide took decades to materialize. Germany did not officially recognize the porajmos as a genocide until 1982, when Chancellor Helmut Schmidt did so in a speech before Romani organizations. On January 18, 1945, Engelbert Markech, a German criminal transferred from Mauthausen, received serial number 202499. He was the last prisoner registered in Auschwitz. That same day, while the Red Army advanced from the east, the SS ordered the evacuation of the camp. Approximately 58,000 detainees, around two-thirds of them Jews, were forced to march westward on foot in the middle of the Polish winter, with temperatures that could reach 20 degrees below zero. Those who could not continue were murdered on the spot. Execution detachments followed the column and killed those who lagged behind. Historian Peter Longerich estimated that a quarter of the deportees, approximately 15,000 people, died during these marches or in the first days of transit by train toward the camps in the interior of Germany. The trains were open cargo wagons in the middle of January 1945. On January 20th, the SS blew up crematoria 2 and 3. On January 23rd, the Canada warehouses, where the confiscated goods of the deportees were stored, were set on fire. They burned for 5 days. Crematorium 5 was destroyed on January 26th, one day before the Red Army arrived. On January 27th, 1945, at 9 in the morning, soldiers of the 100th Rifle Division of the Red Army entered Auschwitz III. Other units of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front reached Auschwitz I and II around 3 in the afternoon. They found 7,000 living prisoners in the 3 main camps, 500 more in the sub-camps, and more than 600 corpses. Soviet Colonel Georgy Elisavetsky described decades later how he tried to speak to the survivors in Russian, in Polish, in German, in Ukrainian, with no response. When he said a few words in Yiddish, identifying himself as Jewish, announcing the liberation, the survivors ran toward the soldiers and knelt. Primo Levi, who was in the infirmary with scarlet fever and had not been evacuated, described the first 4 soldiers on horseback who approached. They cast strangely embarrassed glances at the bodies and at the survivors. "It was that shame we knew so well," he wrote later. "The feeling of guilt that such a crime existed, that it had been irrevocably introduced into the world of existing things." Rudolf Höss was arrested by British intelligence services on March 11, 1946, near Flensburg in northern Germany, where he lived under the alias Franz Lang, working as a farmer. His wife Hedwig had resisted British interrogations for days before revealing her husband's location. He was transferred to Nuremberg to testify in the trial of SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner. His statements before the tribunal, pronounced with a bureaucratic calmness that disturbed even prosecutors accustomed to the most disturbing testimonies, constituted fundamental evidence for the Nuremberg trials. Höss stated before the prosecutors that at least 2.5 million people had been gassed in Auschwitz, although in his subsequent memoirs he qualified that figure, considering it exaggerated. The current academic consensus, based on the studies of Franciszek Piper, establishes the total number of victims at least at 1.1 million. He was extradited to Poland on May 25, 1946. He wrote his memoirs in the Warsaw prison between August and September 1946, published for the first time in Polish in 1951 and in German in 1958 under the title Kommandant in Auschwitz. The Polish Supreme National Tribunal sentenced him to death on April 2, 1947. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged within the grounds of Auschwitz I, next to Crematorium I, which he had built and where he had witnessed the first gassings. In Krakow, from November 25 to December 22, 1947, the Polish Supreme National Tribunal prosecuted 40 former members of the camp staff, 23 death sentences, 7 life sentences, 9 prison sentences. Among those executed, Commander Arthur Lieberhenschel and the head of the women's camp, Maria Mandl. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, held from December 20, 1963 to August 20, 1965, prosecuted 22 defendants over 180 days with a 700-page indictment and a 300-page historical report prepared by the Institut für Zeitgeschichte, including the testimonies of 254 witnesses. Of the 22 defendants, 19 were convicted, 6 to life imprisonment. Of the approximately 6,335 members of the SS staff who worked in Auschwitz, no more than 789, less than 15%, were prosecuted at any time. Since 1941, detailed information about the atrocities committed in Auschwitz circulated among the Allies through multiple channels. The reports of Witold Pilecki, the reports of the Polish government in exile, the testimonies of liberated prisoners. On November 8, 1942, the New York Times published an article titled "Nazis Reported Killing Jews of Europe," based on a statement from the Polish government in exile that described the murder of 1 million Polish Jews. The article appeared on page 10. When the Auschwitz protocols reached the hands of Jewish organizations and Allied governments in the summer of 1944, active requests occurred to bomb the railways leading to Auschwitz or the crematoria themselves. The internal debate in Allied governments was documented in detail in declassified archives decades later. The United States Secretary of War Henry Stimson rejected the bombing proposal in August 1944, arguing that it would divert resources from ongoing military operations. The Royal Air Force conducted reconnaissance flights over Auschwitz in 1944 that produced detailed aerial images of the camp, including the crematoria with their chimneys, which were not analyzed at that time with respect to the extermination installations. On August 20, 1944, Allied bombers attacked the IG Farben plant in Monowitz, a few kilometers from the crematoria, without attacking the extermination installations. In the reconnaissance photographs taken that day by the RAF, crematoria 2 and 3 of Birkenau appear visible. They were not targets. The railway lines leading to Auschwitz were not bombed. The gas chambers were not bombed. The debate over whether having done so would have saved lives, and to what magnitude, remains one of the most controversial in the historiography of the Holocaust. In the summer of 1944, while the Allies debated, the crematoria of Birkenau processed between 8,000 and 12,000 people a day. The final figures of the camp, according to the study by historian Franciszek Piper published by Yad Vashem in 1991, are the following. Of the at least 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, at least 1.1 million were murdered. Of them, approximately 960,000 Jews, 865,000 of whom were gassed directly upon their arrival without being registered. 74,000 ethnic Poles, 21,000 Romani, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, between 10,000 and 15,000 citizens of other European nationalities. 1 in 6 Jews murdered in the Holocaust died in Auschwitz. By countries of origin, the figures are Hungary, 430,000, Poland, 300,000, France, 69,000, Netherlands, 60,000, Greece, 55,000. Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, 46,000, Slovakia, 27,000, Belgium, 25,000, Germany and Austria, 23,000, Yugoslavia, 10,000, Italy, 7,500, Norway, 690. The Germans actively attempted to hide these figures. In July 1942, according to Höss's memoirs, Himmler ordered, through Eichmann's office and SS commander Paul Blobel, that all mass graves were to be opened and the corpses incinerated, and that the ashes were to be disposed of in such a way that it would be impossible in the future to calculate the number of incinerated corpses. The operation received the code name Sonderaction 1005. In 2018, a survey commissioned by the Claims Conference found that 41% of American adults surveyed did not know what Auschwitz was. 22% stated they had never heard of the Holocaust. The figures of the camp are verifiable because the bureaucratic machinery of extermination generated documentation even while attempting to destroy it. The blueprints of the crematoria are in the archives of Yad Vashem. The letters from Bayer to Höss are in the camp archives. The invoices from Topf und Söhne are in the archives of Erfurt. The Wannsee Protocol is in the archives of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Auschwitz did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with a bureaucratic decision in Berlin with an architect who signed a blueprint, with a company that calculated the profitability of slave labor, with a doctor who pointed with his thumb to the right or to the left. The deepest horror of Auschwitz is not that it was possible. It is that it was planned.